All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're breaking down a source that seriously challenges one of the biggest assumptions in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the idea that creating a Palestinian state is the most direct route to peace. It's a really provocative argument, and we're going to walk through exactly how the author builds their case.
So, the whole thing kicks off with this really fundamental question, especially in the wake of the October 7th attacks. The source suggests that the world's immediate reaction, calling for a two-state solution, might actually be missing the bigger picture. It's asking us to stop and think, what are the real goals here? And this quote, this really gets to the absolute heart of the piece. The author's entire argument is built on this idea, that framing the conflict as a simple fight over territory is a fundamental mistake, that after so many decades of failed attempts at peace, we need a different explanation.
Okay, so the first major part of the argument we're going to explore zeroes in on this idea of statehood itself, and why the source claims it isn't the magic bullet solution that many people think it is.
The author's position is pretty clear. Pushing for statehood right after the attacks completely ignores the ideology that has been driving the violence for decades. The argument is that the events of October 7th weren't some desperate cry for new borders, but an expression of something else entirely.
And this is a really crucial point the source makes. It basically says, look, if sovereignty was truly the #1 goal for Palestinian leadership, the historical record just doesn't seem to back that up. This claim really sets the stage for the historical evidence that the author is about to lay out.
And to back up this pretty bold claim, the explainer dives right into the history books, laying out what the author describes as a very clear and consistent pattern, not of negotiation, but of outright refusal.
Now, what's wild about this slide is just the sheer timeline we're looking at. The source lists multiple major high-profile international pushes to create a Palestinian state that span over 80 years. You've got the British Peel Commission way back in the 30s, the famous UN Partition Plan in 47, and then much more modern attempts like Camp David in 2000 or the Olmert Proposal. The article's point is that every single one of these offers was rejected by Palestinian leaders.
And here the author makes a really critical distinction. They argue that this pattern wasn't just, playing hardball or trying to get a better deal. It was a deliberate, consistent, strategic choice to say no to statehood itself.
Wow, this quote really illustrates the author's starkest claim. It draws a direct line between turning down political solutions and the waves of violence against Israeli civilians that followed. The argument being made here is that saying no to a state was, in effect, saying yes to armed struggle.
Okay, so after that historical overview, the source zooms in on what it sees as a much more recent and much more definitive experiment, Israel's unilateral withdrawal from the Gaza Strip back in 2005.
And the article really hammers this point home. This was a total withdrawal. It wasn't partial. Every single Israeli settlement was dismantled, and every last soldier was removed. The entire territory was handed over, giving Palestinians complete autonomy to govern themselves for the very first time.
But the outcome, as laid out in this article, was the exact opposite of what everyone had hoped for. The idea of Gaza becoming a Singapore on the Mediterranean never happened. Instead, the source argues, the territory was systematically transformed into a fortified base for war, with resources poured into military buildup instead of building a state.
And just to give you a sense of the sheer scale of this militarization, the source uses this pretty stunning comparison. It claims that in a tiny strip of land just 25 miles long, Hamas built an underground tunnel network comparable in size to the entire London Underground. That, the author argues, tells you everything you need to know about their real priorities.
All right, so we've looked at the history of negotiations, and we've looked at the Gaza test case. Now the source pulls the camera back even further to examine what it describes as the internal political culture and institutions that are the real obstacles to peace.
To build this case, the article points to a whole range of things it calls a civic landscape that's hostile to peace. It points out that Hamas wasn't imposed, they were elected. It discusses an ideology of martyrdom taught in schools, the naming of public squares after terrorists, and official policies that literally pay salaries to the families of attackers. And on the flip side, it claims peace activists who try to engage with Israelis often face arrest. Next, the source identifies a huge international player that it sees as actually perpetuating the conflict, UNRWA. The argument is that this UN agency is totally unique and plays a political role unlike any other humanitarian organization. This table is really central to the author's point. Just look at the contrast between UNRWA for Palestinians and the UNHCR, which handles all other refugees in the world. For Palestinians, refugee status is hereditary. It's passed down forever. The goal isn't resettlement, it's to maintain the, quote, right of return. And this is the key takeaway, according to the source. It argues this system uniquely preserves refugee status across generations, essentially freezing the conflict in place politically.
Okay, we're in the final section now. Here, we're going to look at the source's conclusion, where it pushes back against common historical comparisons and calls for a complete rethink of what the end game should even be.
You know, you often hear comparisons to South Africa or Northern Ireland. Well, the source confronts those directly. It argues the crucial difference is that in those conflicts, the armed groups renounced violence before any political deal was made. That was their ticket to the negotiating table. By contrast, the author says key Palestinian factions haven't done that, with some groups still officially calling for Israel's destruction.
So where does all this leave us? The author's conclusion is that all the conventional tools in the peacemaking toolbox have been tried. Offering statehood, withdrawing from land, pouring in massive amounts of international aid. The source argues that not only have these approaches failed, but they've often backfired and resulted in more violence.
And this final quote really tries to reframe the entire conversation. It separates the human goal of dignity from the political structure of a state. And it makes the argument that real peace can only happen when violence is taken off the table as a legitimate option.
And that's where we end. The source we've just walked through presents a really challenging and for sure controversial perspective. It essentially dismantles the conventional wisdom about the path to peace, and it leaves us with this final, massive question. If the old map is an illusion, what, if anything, is supposed to take its place?